Hi. We continue in 1 Kings today after Bathsheba has gone into her lord the king, not referring to David as either her husband or the father of the child that they both conceived together. Solomon, obviously, who she refers to simply as the king's slave. And now Nathan, as he predicted, would come in after and, quote, confirm her words. And yet, as we saw last time, Bathsheba added many words to what Nathan had said, and Nathan doesn't exactly confirm her words. He confirms some of her words and adds some different words, as we can see in this chart here that we'll go over in a little bit. And you can see the red parts are the parts are in common, the green parts are where he imitates her, but the black parts are where they each say something separate. So we'll have to see next time what the cumulative effect of this is on David. But it also is telling us something about the characters of each of these people, as we've seen. Something about Bathsheba, who plainly we discovered knew about Adonijah's taking the throne before Nathan said so, because she added about him offering sacrifice, and Nathan hadn't told her that. So she had to know that independently of Nathan, and Nathan, having heard it, repeats it. But he'll add some other things as we see. So to jump in there, let's just situate where we've been. We've been looking at these questions and issues that I went over in the introductory video to these two chapters, 1 Kings 1 and 2. If you haven't watched the introductory video to the larger unit of 1 Kings and 2 Kings, I encourage you to do so, where we go over a number of the issues that will be relevant throughout, including the question and the immediate circumstances of a given passage of, was this written at the time of Solomon to justify his succession, or much later perhaps, based on some other theological or ideological or political needs of a later time. So we are now on these questions down here, the role of Nathan and how do we interpret this approach and David's state of mind. Because as we noted last time, although the text began in this chapter saying David is old and advanced in years and couldn't get warm, both the people in the story and apparently scholars reading it assume that he's old, and, well, he is old, but assume that not only is he old, but that he's senile somehow, that he literally doesn't know what's going on. And I've been questioning whether that's fooling the commentators as it fooled characters earlier on, like King Ashesh of Gath, who was fooled along with the Philistines when David pretended to be a madman back in 1 Samuel. And so we already know, and we've seen several examples, where David can either just plainly pretend to be something he's not, or he can keep his cards close to the vest, or as in his public paean to Saul, act as if he believed that Saul was God's gift all along, despite his many attempts to avoid getting killed by Saul and his opportunities to kill him if he hadn't been the Lord's anointed. So we know that David can be a little slippery in revealing, and he doesn't reveal much here either. So we really don't know what he knew, which is to say, as people like Baden and Alpern suggest, he must certainly have chosen Adonijah or it wouldn't have happened, and he must certainly know about it. But as we'll see today, people like Walter Brueggemann and others assume that Nathan is telling the truth when he says that David didn't know about it. And so we'll each have to resolve that for ourselves as readers. So as we look at the Solomon narrative, as I've been showing, the first two chapters that we're looking at now involve the succession, and then we'll interpret the succession a little more clearly, especially why one coalition was on the side of Adonijah and the other on the side of Solomon, when we see in chapter 4 especially the lineaments of Solomon's reign as king and how different it is from the time of David. And that might be telling us something important about why people were on each side at the time. So as we look at the shape and key words of the section, we're on this chapter here with the prophet, or this section here of the paragraph of the chapter right here. And I could have ended it right here in the paragraph, and I will stop there when King David calls Bathsheba in. And notice there's something that I will reveal now. It's a little bit of a spoiler alert, but I want to highlight the pattern that we're going to see here and that we don't notice immediately as readers. Because in what we saw earlier, we saw that Bathsheba was speaking here, and behold, as we're starting today, while she was still speaking with the king, the prophet Nathan came in. And so we're under the impression, as the cover picture that you can see here that I put on the YouTube channel for this, shows Bathsheba there. And yet when the scene is over, we hear King David answered, "Call Bathsheba to me." So somehow she slipped out. And we'll see the same thing after he makes the decision, and he'll say, "Call to me the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan." So somehow Nathan slips out. So while we're in this scene, it seems like Nathan and Bathsheba are both there. And then while we're in this scene, it seems like Nathan and Bathsheba are both there. But then we find out as a surprise, not. And that's an interesting element where the characters in the story know something we don't know. They obviously know who's in the room and who's not, but the narrator has withheld that from us to put us in the situation of not being 100% clear either. And I think that's really important because so much of what's going on here is having to ferret out people's intentions and knowledge, both amongst the characters in the story. Does David really believe what Bathsheba is saying, and does he believe what Nathan's saying? And do they really believe that the king chose Solomon? Or is that a lie? Or is that a mistake? It's just deeply ambiguous and we can't solve it. So that's the reality. I hope you enjoy that as we go through it. I also have highlighted here, along with the key words, what it looks like when we see the names. And so in this paragraph, we see the different names that are mentioned. And notice Joab is not mentioned here, although in the new RSV it is. You can see on the left side it says Joab, but the Hebrew does not say that. And in fact, it's plural. So he invited the priest Abiathar and the commanders of the army. So Joab is not mentioned here. And we'll look at potentially the reason for that when we get there. That was as of last time, and now we're on it as of this time as well. So as we prepare to enter in our passage, let's just look at the three versions of what's going on. Nathan's instructions earlier in the chapter that we saw, and Bathsheba's speech, and now Nathan's speech. And so Nathan is clearly listening in. He wasn't in the room, but he couldn't have been too far to know that, according to his own command, while you were still there speaking, I will come in. So he has to be close to know what she's saying, and obviously has a great interest in hearing exactly what she says so he can confirm it. And yet he doesn't exactly. We'll see he changes the question around completely. He had told her to ask him, or to ask David rhetorically, did you not swear? So assuming that he did, your son Solomon should succeed. She turns it around and makes it a statement and adds to it, by Yahweh your God, you swore. So she makes it a statement, you did this. And now Nathan turns it around. Have you said Adonijah shall succeed me as king? Doesn't start with Solomon, but starts there. He doesn't get to Solomon down here, and never says that David had already said he'd make Solomon king, contrary to what he told her to say. So we have to ferret out a little bit about what's going on with Nathan as we look at that. Let's look at it from one other angle. As we've been noting from a number of scholars, especially Joel Baden, who thinks Nathan is a fictional character to support Bathsheba here. That's one view of it. Not most scholars don't see it that way. But if we look at it this way, we can see the role that Nathan has in relation to David in the three places he's there. And this section we're on here on the left side of the screen is the last time Nathan will speak in the Bible altogether. He's mentioned as David calls him in the next scene, but he doesn't speak. And the only other mention of Nathan after this chapter is the fact that two of his sons become part of Solomon's retinue in controlling the political situation in Judah and Israel while he's king. So back in 2 Samuel, we note this, and I'm not inviting us to read the whole thing, just to note something simply. It goes on a long way. That same night, the word of Yahweh came to Nathan, go and tell my servant David, thus says Yahweh. And that's what we have here. And he repeats it again, thus says Yahweh. Moreover, Yahweh declares to you. So everything we hear, and the narrator confirms Nathan spoke this. So we hear it spoken from Yahweh to Nathan. We don't hear it spoken from Nathan to David. We simply have the narrator summarizing, Nathan said this. So there's no opportunity to compare, like there is, for example, with Samuel back in 1 Kings 8, what he heard from Yahweh and what he tells the Israelites about monarchy and perhaps about Saul as well. But everything out of Nathan's voice here is the word of Yahweh. Nothing personal about Nathan. Giving the king, of course, wonderfully positive news that someone from his offspring would be on the throne in Jerusalem forever. But in 2 Samuel 12, it's the opposite. Not in the sense of his authority, it's Yahweh again. Yahweh sent Nathan to David, and here we have it. Notice there we don't hear what Yahweh said to Nathan. It's only implied that what Nathan says here is what Yahweh told him to say. But we don't hear that exactly. But again, Nathan's speaking to David in the name of Yahweh. Not indirectly, as we saw back in 2 Samuel 7, where we only heard the narrator telling us what Yahweh said to Nathan, but here we heard explicitly, Nathan said to David 3 times, thus says Yahweh, giving him very bad news. Actually, twice he says it, and once the narrator tells us. Giving him very bad news that everything is going to come apart before all Israel because of what he did with Uriah. So he's at a positive and a negative entry into David's life, and in neither case is there any consequence for Nathan personally. But now it's different. Now he comes in and does obeisance to the king with his face to the ground, literally, as we'll look at in a moment, with his nose to the ground. For whatever reason, the ORSV seems embarrassed by the bodily elements of biblical Hebrew and leaves out things like hands and faces and in this case, a nose, substituting face for nose, but a nose is a much more revealing image, I think. That now he does no quote from Yahweh. There's no mention of Yahweh here at all. And that's interesting given that in the scene that we saw with Bathsheba, Bathsheba quotes Yahweh, saying, by Yahweh your God, but he does not. And he doesn't ever say that didn't you want to make Solomon your successor. So we're going to have to look more closely at that as we go. But what's not being said in the speech to David is what we know because of what Nathan said to Bathsheba in the beginning. If you want to you want to escape with your life and the life of your son. And Nathan, presumably, without having said it, assumes that his life is on the line as well if Adonijah is king, along with the others who have sided with Solomon. But he doesn't say that, and he has to assume that saying that out loud would put the idea in David's mind, and maybe Nathan really believes that David doesn't know what's going on and can be manipulated here, but we don't know that. So let's look just at our key words here and look at our paragraph, and we'll jump right into our section here. So while she was still speaking, and again the New RSV leaves out what I restore here, and behold, and there are several and beholds here, we see another one right in the next sentence. So while she was still speaking with the king, the prophet Nathan came in. And I was noting last time the unusual and unlikely refrain here of saying over and over again, the prophet Nathan, the prophet Nathan. And that's what you can see all over the place here. Look at it 3 times in this immediate thing there. Here it's only Nathan, but twice as the prophet Nathan. As if we as readers, or perhaps as we think David doesn't know, this one is to David, but this one is to readers. So we would certainly know who Nathan was. This is not the first time we're hearing it in the chapter, of course. We heard it way up here several times before. So emphasizing their roles, just like we see the priest Zadok and the priest Abiathar over and over again. It's as if they're not human beings, but simply playing out the role. But in this case, Nathan is concerned, at least implicitly, for his very human life. So the king was told, and notice we don't know by whom. Part of the indirection, part of the mystery of, are there other people in the room? It didn't say nobody else was in the room. It did highlight that Abishag was in the room when Bathsheba came in, making it certainly awkward for her to speak with her husband, after all, and the father of the child that they're talking about, Solomon, in the face of the bedwarmer, the young, beautiful virgin Abishag. We don't know if she's the one who says this. Why does it need to be said? Nothing was said when Bathsheba came in. He obviously recognized Bathsheba. Is the implication that he wouldn't recognize Nathan? Or is it just a surprise that he comes, announced with another, behold the prophet Nathan? And again, we get the impression that Bathsheba is still there, but apparently not, according to what we'll find out later. So when he came before the king, he did obeisance to the king, and with his nose to the ground. And this is recalling other sequences of obeisance there, replicated by Bathsheba, as we'll see below. Although we'll see a very unusual thing in the next scene where David bows down before Bathsheba. The only time in the entire Bible we see a man bow down before a woman. Okay, again, with his nose to the ground. So then he begins to speak. And we noticed last time that David didn't say anything in response to Bathsheba, and he's not going to say anything in response now, at least until he's finished. And then he won't speak to Nathan, but he'll speak to whoever's there calling for Bathsheba. So referring to my lord the king, again, as we saw so many times in this chapter, have you said, omitting the supposed promise to David that he would make Solomon his successor. And then this just comes as a shock, as Falkelman notes below. This paradoxical plea on behalf of the opponent takes our breath away. One must be extremely sure of one's calculations in order to express such outright provocation so dispassionately. Notice when Nathan speaks, David isn't sure what angle he's coming from yet, if his ignorance is as deep as we're told. But if he knows who's on which side, and certainly Bathsheba filled him in, as we see on the right side here, that Solomon wasn't invited into Adonijah's feast, and she's concerned that she and Solomon will be counted as offenders or sinners if Adonijah remains king. So Nathan certainly knows that David's aware of that. But by saying this, does it suggest that Nathan might well be on the side of Adonijah? Is he asking for affirmation or resistance? And putting it positively like this, have you said, as opposed to you have not said, have you, certainly makes it easy for David to say, yes, I have. Most scholars read this as Nathan thinks it's not true, that David hasn't said that. But as I noted earlier, scholars like Halpern and Baden suggest if he hadn't said it out loud, he at least nodded to allow Adonijah to do it. And if he didn't allow Adonijah to do it, he certainly knows about it, because not only his sons, but all the men of Judah were invited to the celebration, and as far as we know, went. And how could David not know that? Bathsheba knew all about it after all, and she's not very far physically from where David is. The word is in the air, obviously, with all the sacrifice and all the noise and the blowing of the trumpet. All the area around Jerusalem must know about Adonijah's bold action. So he says, have you said, Adonijah shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne, taking the exact words that Bathsheba said, that Nathan said to say to her, but substituting Adonijah for Solomon. And without allowing the king to answer, he keeps speaking here, adding some words of his own. For today he has gone down, symbolizing his descent and Solomon's ascent, because otherwise there's a question of going down from where, and has sacrificed oxen, fatted cattle, and sheep in abundance, as we can see here, echoing her exactly, and invited all the king's children. And notice the impression that gives. He doesn't say until down here, oh, and not Solomon. It gives David the initial impression that all the king's sons are now there with Adonijah. And this is misleading here, because this is where Joab is not there in the text. So he invited all the king's children, the commanders of the army, and the priest Abiathar, who ends up being the only one named out loud here, who are now eating and drinking before him, suggesting this is an ongoing feast that could still be interrupted right now, and omits another behold. So 3 beholds in these couple of verses. And saying, and he adds further, long live King Adonijah. As Falkman adds, must be insufferable to any ruling monarch, no matter how weak. Tolerating it in terms of power politics can only mean abdication, which is to say, if we believe that Adonijah is doing this against the will of his father, then that means if Adonijah is king, then David is no longer king. But Falkman is one of those who goes along with the assumption that David doesn't know. And that's one way to read it. But if we read it that David does know, and if David does know that Nathan is here proclaiming this as if David doesn't know, what is that saying about David's attitude about Nathan? Or does David believe that Nathan is lying to him? There are so many possibilities, and we charted out the knowledge and the truth and the deceptions here. It would get very confusing. But isn't that part of the point? That the confusion here, amidst whether it's senility or crowds or sacrifice, is part of what happens through the fog of politics. But David eventually will clarify it so that all know his answer. And now he continues, adding, as a suffix, almost as an afterthought, he did not invite me, your slave, notice not your prophet, your slave, and the priest Zadok and Benaiah son of Yehoiada, and your servant, your slave Solomon. Again, as Bathsheba, referring to the king's son as your servant, literally as your slave. Here, all the king's sons are referred to as the king's sons, the children being inclusive, but we don't know that he has daughters that would be part of the situation here, other than Tamar, and we've not heard about her since the rape earlier. So we don't know about any other daughters as well. So he names this almost as if it's an afterthought and leaves Solomon as the word hanging there. And then he asks it this way, which is a very unusual way to ask it. Has this thing, or better translated, has this become my lord the king's word? And notice what that implies for David. So Nathan presents this situation, the perhaps counterfactual or perhaps accurate statement that David has said that Adonijah should be king, Adonijah responding to that by doing what an anointed king would do, naming the people who aren't invited without suggesting any reason why, and asks if this is what David intended or not. Is this my lord the king's word? But then he continues, you have not let your servants know. And what is the question of knowledge? Is it that David doesn't know? As we saw earlier, that's what Nathan said to Bathsheba, that Adonijah has become king and our Lord the king doesn't know. Does Nathan really believe he doesn't know? It seems to suggest he knows, but he just hasn't told them. That David has made a decision, presumably not for Adonijah, from Nathan's perspective, but not necessarily from Solomon's perspective either. Notice he doesn't raise up Solomon, he only isolates Solomon from all the other possible candidates. So the question is not the knowledge of David, but the knowledge of everybody else about what the king has decided. if the king has decided, which is what Nathan's assuming he's done, rather than what the story might suggest, which he's only about to decide in the next verses. And I won't continue, we'll stop there, but note as I was highlighting, now he says call Bathsheba, highlighting for this scene, she wasn't there. Where did she go? Obviously not very far. Could she have been listening in from outside the door as Nathan was? Almost certainly so. But whether she heard what was saying and whether that affects her, we'll only get to find out when we see what happens when she comes back before the king, her husband, and the father of the child that's at issue. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.